Marcus Thompson adjusted his expensive watch and straightened his designer tie as he stepped out of his black BMW in the parking lot of Harborview Diner. At 28, he had already made his mark as a successful investment banker, and his arrogance showed in every stride. The diner was beneath his usual standards, but his client had insisted on meeting there for lunch. The small coastal town of Millbrook felt suffocating to someone like Marcus, who thrived in the fast-paced world of Manhattan finance. Everything here moved too slowly, from the lazy afternoon breeze to the elderly couple shuffling across the street. He checked his Rolex again, irritated that his client was running late. Inside the diner, the familiar sounds of sizzling bacon and clinking coffee cups filled the air. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, and the black and white checkered floor had seen decades of loyal customers. Marcus chose a corner booth, his polished leather shoes clicking against the worn tiles as he walked. The waitress who approached his table looked to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing a faded blue uniform that had seen better days. Her name tag read Elena. She moved with quiet efficiency, carrying herself with an understated dignity that Marcus completely failed to notice. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I start you with something to drink?" Elena asked politely, her voice carrying the slightest hint of an accent that suggested she might have traveled far to reach this small town. Marcus barely looked up from his phone, where he was scrolling through stock prices. "Yeah, whatever. Just bring me a Coke, and make it quick. I'm expecting someone important." Elena nodded and walked away, returning moments later with a glass filled with ice and a can of Coca-Cola. She set it down carefully on the table, along with a small napkin. "Your Coke, sir. Are you ready to order food, or would you like to wait for your guest?" "I said I was waiting for someone important, didn't I?" Marcus snapped, his attention still glued to his phone screen. "God, do you people not listen?" Elena's expression remained calm and professional, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. "Of course, sir. I'll check back with you in a few minutes." As she turned to leave, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed his client's name, and Marcus answered immediately, his voice shifting to a tone of forced enthusiasm. "Richard, where are you, buddy? I've been waiting here in this establishment for 20 minutes already." The voice on the other end delivered news that made Marcus's face darken. The deal they were supposed to discuss had fallen through. Another firm had swooped in with a better offer, and Richard was calling to cancel their meeting entirely. "What do you mean you're going with Henderson and Associates?" Marcus's voice rose, causing other diners to glance in his direction. "We had an agreement. You can't just—" But Richard had already hung up. Marcus stared at his phone in disbelief, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. This deal was supposed to be his ticket to a major promotion, the kind of success that would have put him in the same league as the city's financial elite. Elena approached the table again, having noticed his distressed state. "Is everything all right, sir? Can I get you anything else?" "Everything is not all right," Marcus exploded, his voice echoing through the small diner. Other customers stopped their conversations to stare. "I just lost the biggest deal of my career because some incompetent small-town diner made me waste my time in this dump." Elena remained calm, her hands folded in front of her. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles, sir. Perhaps some food might help you feel better? Our chef makes an excellent—" "I don't want your food," Marcus shouted, his frustration boiling over. "I want to get out of this pathetic excuse for a town and away from people like you." In his rage, Marcus grabbed the glass of Coke from the table. Without thinking, driven by pure anger and the need to lash out at someone, anyone, he hurled the contents directly at Elena. The dark liquid splashed across her uniform, ice cubes scattering across the floor with sharp, tinkling sounds. The entire diner fell silent. Every customer, every staff member, every person in that small space stopped what they were doing and stared at the scene unfolding before them. Elena stood perfectly still, cola dripping from her hair and uniform, her expression unreadable. "That's what I think of your service and this whole pathetic place," Marcus snarled, throwing a $20 bill on the table. "Keep the change, sweetheart. Maybe now you can afford some lessons in customer service." He stormed out of the diner, leaving Elena standing there as dark stains spread across her blue uniform. The other customers began to murmur among themselves, some reaching for napkins to help clean up the mess. others shaking their heads in disgust at what they had witnessed. But Elena simply straightened her shoulders, wiped a droplet of Coke from her cheek with quiet dignity, and began cleaning up the scattered ice cubes. Her movements were measured and controlled, as if she had faced far worse storms than an angry businessman's tantrum. As Marcus peeled out of the parking lot, his tires squealing against the asphalt, he had no idea that the woman he had just humiliated carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He didn't notice the way she surveyed the situation with tactical precision, or how she seemed to assess each person's reaction with the eye of someone trained to read people under pressure. The other diners, however, began to see something different in Elena as she handled the situation with remarkable composure. There was something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself even while soaked in cola, that suggested she was far more than just a small-town waitress. Old Henry Matthews, a retired fisherman who had been coming to the diner for 30 years, stood up from his booth and approached Elena with a handful of napkins. "That boy don't know who he just messed with, does he, Admiral?" he said quietly, using a title that made several nearby customers turn their heads. Elena looked at Henry with a small smile, the first expression other than professional courtesy she had shown all afternoon. Some people see only what they expect to see, Henry, and that's often their first mistake. As she continued cleaning up, Marcus was already speeding down the coastal highway, his mind racing with anger and self-pity. He had no idea that the woman he had just drenched in cola had once commanded a naval destroyer, had led rescue operations in hurricane-ravaged seas, and had earned the respect of sailors and officers across 3 different fleets. He had no idea that Elena Rodriguez had taken early retirement from the Navy just 6 months ago, choosing to return to her hometown of Millbrook to care for her aging mother. He didn't know that she had worked at the diner not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to stay connected to the community that had raised her. Most importantly, Marcus had no idea that Admiral Elena Rodriguez maintained close friendships with powerful people in both military and civilian circles, people who valued loyalty and despised the kind of arrogance he had just displayed. As Elena finished cleaning up and returned to serving her other customers with the same quiet professionalism, she couldn't help but think about the young man's behavior. In her 30 years of military service, she had encountered many types of people under stress, and she recognized Marcus's type immediately. Someone who had never faced real adversity, never learned the value of treating others with respect regardless of their station in life. The incident troubled her not because of the humiliation she had suffered, but because it reminded her of a larger problem she had observed in society. Too many people, especially those with money and position, had forgotten that true strength came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. She decided that perhaps it was time for Marcus Thompson to learn a lesson that the Navy had taught her long ago, that actions have consequences, and that the way you treat people when you think it doesn't matter is exactly when it matters most. Marcus, meanwhile, was already planning how to spin the afternoon's events to his colleagues back in Manhattan. He would make it sound like the small-town meeting had been a waste of time from the start, conveniently leaving out his own behavior. He had always been good at rewriting history to make himself look better, a skill that had served him well in the cutthroat world of investment banking. But as he drove through the winding coastal roads, passing fishing boats and seaside cottages, Marcus failed to notice the small signs that might have told him more about the town he was so eager to leave behind. He missed the memorial plaque dedicated to local veterans, the small naval museum near the harbor, and the marina where several impressive yachts flew flags that would have been familiar to anyone with knowledge of military protocol. Most importantly, he missed the small crowd that had gathered outside Harborview Diner, not to gossip about the incident, but to check on Elena and express their outrage at how she had been treated. These were not just random customers, but longtime residents who remembered when Elena Rodriguez had been the pride of Millbrook, the local girl who had risen to become one of the youngest admirals in the Navy's history. As the sun began to set over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elena finally finished her shift at the diner. She changed out of her stained uniform and into casual clothes, but even in jeans and a simple sweater, there was something unmistakably commanding about her presence. She walked to her car, a modest sedan that belied her substantial military pension, and sat for a moment in the driver's seat, thinking about the day's events. Tomorrow, she decided, she would make some phone calls. Not to seek revenge, but to ensure that Marcus Thompson learned something about accountability. After all, the young man clearly had potential, but potential without character was worse than useless. It was dangerous, and Admiral Elena Rodriguez had spent her entire career neutralizing dangerous situations before they could cause real harm. Marcus Thompson returned to his Manhattan office the following Monday morning with his usual swagger, but underneath his confident exterior, he was still burning with frustration over the failed deal in Millbrook. He had spent the weekend spinning the story to his colleagues, painting himself as the victim of small-town incompetence and unprofessionalism. "You wouldn't believe this place," he told his assistant, Jennifer, as she brought him his morning coffee. "Complete backwater. The service was so bad I had to leave before my client even showed up. No wonder that town is dying." Jennifer nodded politely, though she noticed Marcus seemed more agitated than usual. In the 2 years she had worked for him, she had learned to read his moods carefully. Today felt different, like he was trying too hard to convince himself of his own story. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in Millbrook, Elena Rodriguez was beginning her own Monday morning routine. But instead of heading to the diner, she was in her home office, surrounded by the commendations, photographs, and mementos of her distinguished naval career. On her desk lay a thick folder containing information that would have made Marcus's blood run cold, had he known about it. Elena had spent her Sunday afternoon making quiet inquiries. A few phone calls to former colleagues, a review of public records, and some discreet conversations with people in the financial sector had painted a detailed picture of exactly who Marcus Thompson was and what kind of person she was dealing with. The young investment banker had a pattern, Elena discovered. This wasn't the first time he had treated service workers poorly. There were complaints from restaurant staff, building maintenance crews, and delivery drivers. Stories of verbal abuse, unreasonable demands, and a general attitude that anyone in a service position was beneath his consideration. More troubling was what Elena learned about Marcus's professional conduct. He had a reputation for taking credit for other people's work, for throwing colleagues under the bus when deals went south, and for using his family connections to escape consequences for his behavior. His success was built more on manipulation and inherited privilege than genuine talent or hard work. Elena sat back in her chair, studying a photograph on her wall that showed her receiving the Navy Distinguished Service Medal from the Secretary of the Navy. She thought about the oath she had taken as a young officer, the promise to defend not just her country, but the values it represented. Respect, integrity, service before self. Everything that Marcus Thompson seemed to lack. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a familiar name, Admiral Janet Morrison, her former commanding officer and now a senior Pentagon official. "Elena, how's retirement treating you?" Janet's warm voice filled the room. "It's an adjustment," Elena replied with a smile. "I'm finding ways to stay busy." "I heard about what happened at the diner yesterday," Janet said, her tone growing serious. "Word travels fast in military circles, especially when it involves one of our own being disrespected." Elena wasn't surprised that news had reached Pentagon corridors so quickly. The military community was tight-knit, and Admiral Rodriguez had earned tremendous respect during her career. When a decorated officer was publicly humiliated, people noticed. "It wasn't about disrespect to me personally," Elena said carefully. "It was about what that young man's behavior says about him as a person, and, more importantly, what it suggests he might do to others who can't defend themselves." "What do you want to do about it?" Janet asked directly. Elena looked out her window toward the harbor, where fishing boats were heading out for their morning catch. "I want him to learn something. Not to be destroyed, but to understand that actions have consequences. That the way you treat people matters." "What do you need?" "Information. Connections. The kind of pressure that can only come from people who understand the value of character over wealth." Janet was quiet for a moment. "Elena, you know I trust your judgment. If you think this is worth pursuing, I'll help however I can. But are you sure you want to go down this road?" "I've spent 30 years of my life serving something bigger than myself," Elena replied. "I've seen what happens when good people do nothing about bad behavior. This Marcus Thompson is young enough to change, but only if someone shows him that his current path leads nowhere good. That afternoon, while Marcus was bragging to clients about his supposed business acumen, Elena was receiving a series of phone calls that would have terrified him. Admiral Morrison had reached out to her network, and that network was extensive and influential. The first call came from Patricia Williams, a former Navy intelligence officer who now served as senior vice president at one of Manhattan's most prestigious investment firms. Patricia had worked with Elena on several classified operations during the Gulf War, and they had maintained their friendship through the decades. Janet Morrison told me what happened, Patricia said without preamble. I've been doing some checking on this Marcus Thompson character. His firm, Davidson & Associates, handles some of our subsidiary accounts. Elena listened as Patricia painted a picture of a young man whose career was built on shaky foundations. His biggest successes had come through family connections rather than skill, and his colleagues had been covering for his mistakes for months. The word around here is that he's being considered for a major promotion, Patricia continued. Senior vice president, with his own client portfolio. But there are concerns about his judgment and temperament. What kind of concerns? Elena asked. The kind that makes senior partners nervous. He's brilliant with numbers, I'll give him that. But he's alienated half his team with his arrogance. HR has fielded multiple complaints about his treatment of support staff. Nothing actionable, but a clear pattern. Elena made notes as Patricia talked, her tactical mind already formulating a strategy. This wasn't about revenge, it was about intervention. Marcus Thompson was on a path that would eventually lead to his own downfall, but not before he hurt other people along the way. The second call came from Colonel Robert Shun, Elena's former operations officer who now worked as a defense contractor with major corporate clients. Robert had served under Elena during 3 deployments, and he had learned her approach to problem solving, precise, methodical, and devastatingly effective. I hear you've got a situation that needs handling, Robert said in his characteristic direct style. A teaching moment, Elena corrected. There's a young man who needs to understand that character matters more than credentials. What's the target? Elena smiled at Robert's military terminology. Marcus Thompson, investment banker at Davidson & Associates. He needs to learn some humility before his arrogance destroys his career and hurts innocent people. I'll make some inquiries, Robert promised. I know people in the financial sector who value integrity. They might be interested in hearing about character issues in their industry. By Wednesday, the first ripples of Elena's quiet campaign began to reach Marcus's world. It started with small things that he initially dismissed as coincidences. A lunch meeting with a potential client was suddenly postponed. A referral from a family friend fell through unexpectedly. A networking event invitation was mysteriously withdrawn. Marcus attributed these setbacks to the usual volatility of the business world, but his assistant Jennifer began to notice a pattern. Phone calls that used to be returned promptly were now going unanswered. Emails that should have generated immediate responses sat in inboxes without replies. Mr. Thompson, Jennifer said carefully on Thursday morning, I think there might be something going on. 3 different clients have called to reassess their relationships with us, and 2 potential new accounts have decided to go with other firms. Marcus looked up from his computer screen, where he had been tracking his portfolio performance. It's just market uncertainty, he said dismissively. These people get nervous over nothing. But, privately, Marcus was beginning to worry. The financial world was built on relationships and reputation, and something seemed to be affecting both. He couldn't put his finger on what had changed, but he sensed that conversations were happening without him, decisions being made that he wasn't part of. Meanwhile, Elena was receiving regular updates from her network of former military colleagues who had transitioned into civilian leadership positions. The picture they painted was of a young man whose professional world was slowly but steadily contracting as word spread through informal channels about his character deficiencies. Admiral Morrison called with the most significant development. I had lunch with Treasury Secretary Harrison yesterday, she said. Turns out his daughter works in the financial sector in New York. When I mentioned your situation, he was very interested. Elena knew that Secretary Harrison was a former Marine general who shared her views on leadership and character. His influence in financial circles was substantial, and his opinion carried weight with CEOs and board members across Wall Street. He's going to make some quiet inquiries, Admiral Morrison continued. not to destroy anyone's career, but to ensure that promotion decisions are made with full awareness of character issues. Elena felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Marcus Thompson was about to learn that reputation was fragile and that treating people badly had real consequences in the adult world. On Friday afternoon, Marcus received a call that made his hands shake. Davidson and Associates senior partner, William Davidson himself, wanted to see him in the executive conference room immediately. The tone of the request made it clear this wasn't a friendly chat about his career prospects. As Marcus walked through the mahogany-paneled corridors toward Davidson's office, he tried to control his rising panic. The last few days had been a nightmare of canceled meetings and cold shoulders, but he still couldn't understand what had gone wrong. William Davidson was a man in his 60s who had built the firm from nothing into one of Manhattan's most respected investment houses. He valued results, but he valued character more, having learned through decades of experience that talented people without integrity were ultimately destructive to any organization. "Marcus, sit down," Davidson said without his usual pleasantries. "I've been hearing some disturbing things about you." Marcus tried to maintain his composure. "Sir, if this is about the Millbrook deal falling through, I can explain. This isn't about a business deal," Davidson interrupted. "This is about you as a person. I've had 3 phone calls this week from people whose opinions I respect, all telling me the same thing, that you have serious character issues that make you unsuitable for advancement in this firm." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. "I don't understand, sir. Who would say something like that? What character issues?" Davidson leaned back in his leather chair, studying the young man across from him. "The way you treat service workers. Your arrogance toward people you consider beneath you. Your pattern of taking credit for other people's work and blaming others for your failures. Sir, I think someone has given you false information about me. I've always been professional." "Marcus," Davidson said quietly, "these people don't give false information. They're former military officers who now hold positions of considerable influence in the business world. When they tell me that someone lacks the character necessary for leadership, I listen." Marcus's mind raced, trying to connect dots that he couldn't quite see. Military officers? How could his behavior in a small-town diner have reached people with that kind of influence? "I want you to think very carefully about your actions over the past few weeks," Davidson continued. "And I want you to consider whether there's anything you need to tell me about how you've been representing this firm and treating other people." As Marcus sat in that conference room, his career hanging in the balance, he began to realize that the woman he had humiliated with a glass of Coke might not have been just a small-town waitress after all. But he still had no idea just how far his single act of cruelty was about to reach, or how thoroughly it would change the trajectory of his entire life. Marcus Thompson spent the weekend in a state of growing panic. William Davidson's words echoed in his mind as he paced around his expensive Manhattan apartment, trying to piece together how his world had suddenly begun to crumble. He had called his father, a successful lawyer with his own powerful connections, but even those family ties seemed unable to stop whatever was happening to his career. His father's phone calls to old friends in the financial sector had yielded disturbing results. Everyone was polite but distant, speaking in vague terms about concerns and character assessments that made no sense to Marcus. The more his father pressed for details, the more clear it became that something significant had shifted in how people perceived Marcus Thompson. "Son," his father had said during their Sunday evening conversation, "I think you need to tell me exactly what happened during that trip to Millbrook. And I mean everything, not the sanitized version you gave me before." But Marcus still couldn't bring himself to admit the full truth about his behavior at the diner. He had convinced himself that throwing a Coke at a waitress was a minor moment of frustration that no one important could possibly care about. Meanwhile, Elena Rodriguez was preparing for the final phase of her carefully orchestrated lesson. She had received word that Marcus was finally beginning to understand the seriousness of his situation, but she suspected he still didn't comprehend the real reason for his troubles. On Monday morning, Elena drove to Harborview Diner for what would be her last shift. She had made a decision over the weekend that would either complete Marcus Thompson's education or confirm that he was beyond redemption. At Davidson and Associates, Marcus arrived at work to find a message waiting for him that made his blood run cold. William Davidson wanted to see him again, and this time he wasn't alone. The meeting would include Patricia Williams from Stratford Investment Group, one of their most important partner firms. Marcus had heard of Patricia Williams by reputation. She was known as one of the sharpest minds on Wall Street, a woman whose approval could make careers and whose disapproval could end them. What he didn't know was that Patricia was the former Navy intelligence officer who had served with Admiral Elena Rodriguez in multiple combat zones. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock, giving Marcus 4 hours to contemplate his fate. He tried to work on client portfolios, but his hands shook every time he reached for his coffee cup. His assistant Jennifer noticed his distress and tried to offer encouragement, but Marcus barely heard her words. At exactly 2 o'clock, Marcus found himself sitting across from William Davidson and Patricia Williams in the firm's executive conference room. Patricia was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through whatever facade people tried to present. She studied Marcus with the same intensity she had once used to analyze enemy intelligence reports. "Marcus," Davidson began, "Ms. Williams has some information she wants to share with you. I think you'll find it enlightening." Patricia opened a folder on the table and removed several documents. "Mr. Thompson, I want to tell you about someone. A woman named Elena Rodriguez. Do you recognize that name?" Marcus felt his stomach drop, though he wasn't sure why. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Elena Rodriguez," Patricia continued, "is a retired admiral in the United States Navy. She served for 30 years, commanding destroyers, leading rescue operations, and eventually rising to become one of the youngest flag officers in naval history. She received the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, and commendations from 3 different presidents." Marcus's face had gone pale. Something about this was starting to make terrible sense, but he still couldn't quite connect the dots. "Admiral Rodriguez retired 6 months ago," Patricia went on, "and returned to her hometown of Millbrook to care for her aging mother. To stay connected with her community and help support a local business, she took a part-time job at Harborview Diner." The blood drained completely from Marcus's face as the pieces fell into place. The waitress, the woman he had humiliated, whose uniform he had soaked with coke. She had been a military admiral. "Last Sunday afternoon," Patricia said, her voice growing colder. "Admiral Rodriguez was working her shift at the diner when a young investment banker threw a glass of coke at her because he was angry about a business deal falling through. This banker called her pathetic, insulted the town she loves, and stormed out after treating a decorated war hero like garbage." Marcus tried to speak, but no words came out. His worst nightmare was unfolding before him, and he finally understood why his professional world had been collapsing around him. "Admiral Rodriguez didn't want revenge," Patricia continued. "She wanted education. She wanted the young man who had humiliated her to learn something about character, about consequences, and about treating other people with basic human dignity." William Davidson leaned forward, his expression grim. "Marcus, Admiral Rodriguez has more friends in positions of influence than almost anyone I know. Military officers who became CEOs, defense contractors, government officials, financial leaders who served their country before building their careers. When word spread about how you treated her, these people took notice." Marcus found his voice, though it came out as a whisper. "I had no idea who she was." "That's exactly the point," Patricia said sharply. "You didn't know who she was, so you felt free to treat her badly. Admiral Rodriguez has spent 3 decades dealing with people who think rank and position give them the right to abuse others. She knows the type, and she knows how dangerous they can become if no one ever teaches them better." Davidson placed a document on the table in front of Marcus. "This is a detailed report on your behavior patterns, compiled by people who understand leadership and character. Multiple incidents of treating service workers poorly, a pattern of taking credit for other people's work, complaints from colleagues about your arrogance and disrespect." Marcus stared at the document, seeing his career reflected through the eyes of people who valued integrity over profit. Everything looked different from this perspective, uglier and more damaging than he had ever realized. "There's something else," Patricia said. "Admiral Rodriguez requested a meeting with you. She'll be at Harborview Diner this afternoon at 4 o'clock. She wants to give you an opportunity to demonstrate whether you've learned anything from this experience. Marcus looked up, hope and terror warring in his expression. What kind of meeting? The kind where you apologize, Davidson said bluntly. Where you acknowledge what you did wrong and show that you understand why it matters. The kind where you demonstrate that you're capable of growth and change. Patricia stood up, preparing to leave. Mr. Thompson, Admiral Rodriguez still believes that people can change if they choose to. She's willing to give you a chance to prove that her faith in human nature isn't misplaced. But this is your only chance. If you go to that diner and show the same arrogance you displayed before, your career in finance is over. After Patricia left, William Davidson studied Marcus for a long moment. Son, I've built this firm on the principle that talent without character is worthless. You have talent, but this past week has shown me that your character is seriously lacking. If you can't fix that, you have no future here. Marcus spent the next hour sitting in his office, staring out the window at the Manhattan skyline. His entire worldview was crashing down around him, replaced by a harsh reality where actions had consequences and treating people badly actually mattered. At 3:30, he got in his car and began the drive to Millbrook, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. The journey that had seemed like a brief inconvenience a week ago now felt like the longest trip of his life. Harborview Diner looked exactly the same as when he had stormed out 7 days earlier, but Marcus saw it differently now. Instead of a pathetic backwater establishment, he recognized it as a small business serving its community, staffed by people who deserved basic respect regardless of their position in society's hierarchy. Elena Rodriguez was waiting for him in the same corner booth where his tantrum had occurred. She was wearing civilian clothes now, but Marcus could see what he had missed before: the straight posture, the alert eyes, the bearing of someone accustomed to command and responsibility. Marcus approached the table slowly, his expensive suit feeling ridiculous in the simple diner. Elena gestured for him to sit, and he did so carefully, as if the booth might collapse under the weight of his shame. Admiral Rodriguez, Marcus began, his voice shaking. I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give. Elena studied him quietly, her expression neither hostile nor welcoming. Tell me what you learned this week, Mr. Thompson. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his entire future depended on his next words. I learned that I've been living my life wrong, that I've been treating people badly because I thought their opinions didn't matter, that I've been measuring my worth by how much money I make instead of by how I treat other people. What else? Elena asked. I learned that actions have consequences, even when you think no one important is watching. I learned that there's no such thing as an unimportant person, and that treating anyone badly reflects who you are as a human being. Elena nodded slowly. And what are you going to do with that knowledge? Marcus looked around the diner, seeing the other customers and staff members who were pretending not to listen but were obviously aware of the conversation taking place. I'm going to change, he said simply. I'm going to apologize to every person I've treated badly. I'm going to learn to see service as honorable work, not something to look down on. And I'm going to try to become the kind of person who deserves the opportunities I've been given. Elena was quiet for a long moment, evaluating his sincerity with the same analytical skills she had used to assess subordinates during her military career. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Thompson, I could have destroyed your career completely. I chose not to because I believe people can change if they want it badly enough. But if you go back to your old ways, if you forget this lesson and return to treating people as if their dignity doesn't matter, there won't be a second chance. Marcus nodded, understanding completely. Admiral, how can I make this right? How can I prove that I've really learned something? Elena smiled for the first time since he had arrived. You can start by treating every person you encounter with the respect they deserve as a human being. You can use your position and privilege to lift others up instead of putting them down. And you can remember that true success is measured by the positive impact you have on other people's lives. She stood up from the booth, extending her hand to Marcus. The military taught me that leadership is about service, not power. Business leaders would do well to learn the same lesson. Marcus shook her hand, feeling the strength and steadiness that had carried Admiral Elena Rodriguez through 3 decades of distinguished service. Thank you for giving me a chance to learn this lesson instead of just destroying me for not knowing it. Everyone deserves a chance to grow, Elena replied. Whether you take advantage of that chance is entirely up to you. As Marcus drove back to Manhattan that evening, he thought about the woman he had underestimated so completely. Admiral Elena Rodriguez had shown him more mercy than he deserved, but she had also demonstrated a kind of strength he had never encountered before, the strength to teach rather than destroy, to build character rather than tear it down. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson was a different person. He had kept every promise he made in that diner booth. He apologized personally to every colleague and service worker he had treated badly. He implemented mentorship programs for junior staff at his firm. He volunteered at local charities and learned to find satisfaction in helping others rather than just advancing his own career. The promotion to senior vice president eventually came, but by then, Marcus understood that true success wasn't measured by titles or salary figures. It was measured by the respect of people who knew him well, by the positive difference he made in other people's lives, and by the character he demonstrated when he thought no one important was watching. And sometimes, when he was having a particularly challenging day, Marcus would drive back to Millbrook and have lunch at Harborview Diner. Elena no longer worked there, having been appointed to the town council, where she could serve her community in a different way, but Marcus still went there to remember the lesson that had changed his life. He would sit in that corner booth and think about how a single moment of cruelty had nearly cost him everything, and how the grace of a decorated admiral had given him the chance to become a better man. It was a lesson he would never forget, and a debt he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay through how he chose to treat other people.